Maggie Kuhn changed the way we think about aging. In 1970, when she started the Gray Panthers, she felt entirely constrained by retirement. She felt that she had been put in a box. Older people were not allowed to work, were not expected to socialize with people of other age groups, were not expected to have sex, were not expected to contribute to society. And Maggie was determined to beat down those walls for herself and for all the other generations to follow.
She used to instruct us, do something outrageous every day.
Maggie had read somewhere, I think it was Buddhist meditation, and one of the things, if you really want to meditate really good, you're supposed to stick your tongue out, and that's supposed to help you to really focus and everything. So Maggie came up with this idea of the Gray Panther growl.
It was all to break the stereotypes that old people were out of sight, out of mind.
Maggie went to Pole Town, outside Detroit. They were to build a Cadillac plant, and Ralph Nader called her in because there were a lot of older people that were going to be affected. They were going to knock down all their houses, the churches, the entire community.
She went up to the pulpit and put her hands on the podium and let out a blood-curdling Gray Panther scream to establish the proper atmosphere of defiance.
Well, the next day, the front page, Detroit, I think it's the Detroit Free Press, there's Maggie. Ah! You know, her tongue was spilling out all over this page.
Now let's do the Great Panther growl. Stand tall. Now raise your arms, both arms as high as you can. High, high, high. And then we're reaching toward each other with love and hope and compassion. And then we open our mouths, ready to cry out against injustice. Now stick out your tongue as far as you can. Way out, way, way out. Roll 3 times right from the depth of your belly. Ah! 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 The Gray Panthers began in 1970, the spring of 1970, when I was forced to retire, and I found myself in the same predicament with 5 of my friends, and we were sad, and in a sense mourning for what we used to do. We loved the jobs that we did, and the idea of retirement had distressed us. And the question, what do you do with the rest of your life? What do you do?
There are, of course, the usual tried and true stopgap measures designed to help the old folks pass the day by.
But she's full of vitality. The Vietnam War is going on. Students are protesting. The civil rights movement, she wants to be part of that.
When she was told by the Presbyterian Church that there's a mandatory retirement age at 65, she felt she was just getting started. And I thought that was one of the most significant, shall we say, retirements in modern American history.
At the retirement party, they meant well, her bosses of the Presbyterian Church. They also were thinking of, oh, she's a woman. Oh, she's a lady. And the gift was a sewing machine.
She was absolutely mortified over that present. She loved to say that she never, ever opened that sewing machine.
She preferred a mimeograph machine. We roll out all those leaflets, come to this rally to fight that obscene military adventure in which young lives are lost. Join the civil rights movement. I want a mimeograph machine. By God. So she and her colleagues got one. And the rest is, as they say, history.
Maggie's father was working for the Bradstreet Company and was relocated to Memphis, Tennessee. Maggie's mother was just absolutely shocked and appalled by the segregated South. She refused to have Maggie born in a segregated city.
So in utero, we went to Buffalo, where I was born in my grandmother's front bedroom, August 3rd, 1905. My father was head of the house. My mother was always attempting to mediate father's dictatorial and rather austere way of approaching life.
There were lots of problems with Maggie's brother, who showed signs of mental illness and then eventually became mentally ill. Maggie said it was mostly a stony silence in that household. While her mother protected Sam and babied him, the father said, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, get your work done, and Maggie was in between trying to help her brother and feeling very guilty that she had stolen her brother's birthright. So, you know, I think Maggie just really learned from early on that you keep all those feelings inside and you don't talk about it and you just go on. Her father was a corporate executive and the family was always on the move. Cleveland was their first real home. Maggie was an ambitious young woman, and she really would have liked to have gone to a college in the East. Her father absolutely refused. He was determined that she stay in Cleveland to attend Case Western.
Mr. Kuhn was very, very possessive as far as Maggie was concerned. Every time she would bring a boyfriend home, her father was actually rude. Sometimes he wouldn't stay in the room. If he stayed in the room, he completely ignored the young man, wouldn't talk to him, wouldn't even acknowledge his presence. It was the joke of the family. Every time a young man became especially interested in Maggie, Maggie got sent off to someplace. She and her mother always went together. They went to Bermuda. They went to Europe 2 or 3 times. They went to South America. They just went all over on these beautiful, beautiful cruise ships. She did have one friend that her father approved of. He was a young doctor. Maggie was quite interested in him. All of a sudden, Maggie felt he was being entirely too bossy. He was telling her what dress she should wear, what hat she should wear. Maggie thought, he's just like my father. I don't want any part of him. And that was the end of that romance.
In college, I was an honor student for the first 2 years and on the dean's list. In my 3rd year, I had a rip-snorting love affair. Oh, what a love affair. And I got behind in my studies. I didn't make the deadline for term paper. You know, that you don't do. But I learned many other things that I've never forgotten.
In her classes, some of the professors wanted the students to know how the other half of the world lived. And so they would take them in the neighborhoods where poor people lived. And this sort of rang a bell for Maggie.
During the college years, a small group of us were members of the Socialist Party. A small group. And we met regularly, quietly, and talked about the future. And recognizing that a capitalistic system was not the only way.
There was this euphoric moment in the 20s. The goose hung high, that was the phrase then. Get rich quick. Everybody was in stocks, it seemed. Even the shoe shine guys, everybody was in stocks. And then, bam, it went down.
Her father had invested very heavily in real estate, and then came the crash, and he lost a fortune.
The Depression officially began that late October day, 1929, when the stock market crashed. And then came FDR and the New Deal. And then came the Wagner Act and the right to organize a union. Then came the industrial unions. And Maggie was right in the middle of that from beginning on.
One of her first jobs was at the YMCA in Cleveland. And then when her parents moved to Philadelphia, she was able to get a job with the YMCA here.
The YWCA at the time was in the forefront of organizing poor industrial women.
Maggie would go to the factories and recruit the women to come to the YWCA. She also encouraged women to belong to the union, an unheard of situation.
When I first tried as a young woman to be my own person, my father opposed what I was doing, the new and revolutionary thoughts that I was thinking, the people whom I was meeting. Was involved, luckily, in some of the early beginnings of the women's trade union movement and the organizing of young women who were oppressed and working in very, you know, what those situations were.
Women were afraid of the union. They thought unions were bad, not good for them. She taught them what the unions could do for them. Equal pay for equal work. No longer working 6 days a week and sometimes 10 and 12 hours a day. She also encouraged women to take some physical education activities, learn to swim, learn to dance.
At the YWCA, she offered a course in human sexuality to women, which I think at the time was really unusual. And she said they talked about everything from the mechanics of sex to the pleasures.
We all learned how to teach sexuality classes. That was the fun part. The funny thing was, when I came along, I knew very little about sex education. I had to learn it myself. But long before that, Maggie was the one. She studied it. She was self-taught. Maggie used every opportunity as a teaching point for broadening the lives of other women and men too.
Came to New York to work in the offices of the Presbyterian Church in 1950. It was a critical, crucial time because the church was beginning to address some of the hurts of society.
I asked the waitress for a hamburger and a Coke.
I said, I'm sorry, our management does not allow us to serve niggers in here.
In the 50s, the issue was equal opportunity, the opening of all schools. In the 60s, when the cities were burning, when young adults were afraid to walk the streets because of their racial and ethnic identity, Maggie used the offices of the church to speak out and to change those conditions.
Maggie is an offspring or daughter of the tradition of progressive Christianity, someone who took their faith so seriously that they had to find a way to live it in the world and to change injustice wherever they would find it.
I don't think Maggie had an easy time being a social activist within the church. Always there are those who would prefer that we preach the gospel, but not be active and on the street, making use of the church to respond to social need. Maggie was willing and able to do that through action, through writings, through programs, through her own witness. To me, this was the power of her life at that moment.
There was a women's delegation from the Presbyterian Church, and we went to New York City. So Maggie decided she would meet us and she would show us what was going on with the underground. We nearly died. We said we'd never, ever go back to Buffalo, tell any of our friends, especially the Presbyterian minister and his wife. One of the places that she took us was the underground setup for the Black Panthers, and we spent an afternoon with all the big ones in the Black Panthers in New York City. She wasn't a member or anything like that, but she felt it was important to know what was going on.
Maggie felt action. That's a Solinsky word as well. Action. The action makes people feel they count. You see, if you stand by, especially older people, and you're helpless, then you become helpless, you see. But if you actually take part in something, something happens to you chemically, something happens to you biologically, something happens to you socially, and suddenly you realize you're alive, but more important, that you count. You count. That's what it's about.
She had a secret love life. When she lived in Philadelphia, she was going out with an insurance salesman who her father just thought was way beneath her. Then when she lived in Boston, she was going out with the manager of their building, and he was Black. And I'm sure she never told her parents about the Boston affair. When she finally went to the church, she met a minister who was very prominent in the social action arm of the church. They were passionately involved in social causes and shared an intellectual, you know, it was a real meeting of the minds. He was married, and they carried on a secret affair for 15 years. I would say to her sometimes, well, Maggie, were you heartbroken over some of these affairs? And she'd say, well, I never forget this because I thought it was so funny. Salacious as it may sound, Chris, no, it was always on to the next.
I've had many love affairs. And I could have a wonderful love affair now if I had time for it. But it takes time to have a really good love affair.
There were a couple times in Maggie's life when she really got depressed. One, when she was in her 30s and everybody else was getting married, and she looked around and said, I'm different. And I think when she was forced to retire because she was scared to death that she was going to have to become a full-time caregiver to her brother. She fed on travel and being involved in her work.
I remember she said, by the year 2020, which is a perfect vision year, people of 65 will outnumber people 25 and under, because we're living longer. But the paradox is we still have something called ageism that is more pervasive than racism or homophobia or sexism. And that's, you're old, you're out.
So much of what we do in our society is determined by our jobs. And the first thing you ask a person that you meet, a stranger, what do you do? And if you don't have a job, you are a no.
She went to 5 other women who were in executive positions, and they sat down and had lunch together in New York, and they talked about all their possibilities, and they decided that they were going to organize.
Freedom's just another word for nothing left to lose. That's it, you see. That's the theme. Because the idea, in a sense, Maggie was saying that to her friends who are now 65 and mandatorily retired. You have nothing left to lose.
You can't be fired from your job. You are free.
The first meeting that they called, they held it at Columbia City, and over 100 people showed up. The next few meetings, which were all throughout sort of the East Coast, Princeton, Philadelphia, Washington, D.C., young people started to go.
The issue that we were going to work on was the war in Vietnam. We were going to stand with the young people who were being drafted and who were resisting the draft. We were going to call into question that illegal, immoral war that we could not win. And that got us started.
Demonstrations against the Vietnam War and the civil rights demonstrations and the women's rights, the student revolts. They all created an atmosphere of feasibility that things could change. And Maggie sensed that, of course, and took advantage of it.
Gerontology in the early 70s was new. A new discipline, a new concern for government, a new area for education and training. And Maggie was the first one in this new field to recruit young people and educate them that you too will be old someday. But she also worked with old people to educate them not to think their lives were over and they couldn't contribute and to be ashamed.
Maggie deplored the idea of being called a senior group, and she said, we're not going to be another service organization. We want to be action-oriented. We are radical.
There was some radio guy who coined the phrase Gray Panthers because of her association with the Black Panthers, describing her as just being radical and wild, but it was a name that caught on and it had a lot of sparkle. So instead of being sort of just an ordinary advocacy group, they suddenly became the Gray Panthers and a lot of media attention.
Many of the Gray Panthers originally came from the labor union movements of the 20s and 30s. Many of them had been part of the communist movement in this country in the early days. And these individuals felt strongly about issues like the peace movement and about stereotypes of aging, about political things. And we're really interested in having fundamental social change take place in this country. They weren't fooling around.
It is nice to block the doorway. It is nice to go to jail. There are nicer ways to do it, but the nice ways always fail. It isn't nice, it isn't nice. You told us once, you told
What do you do after you've been an activist in the anti-war movement and we won a victory there? What do you do next? Well, I was getting on in age and the senior problems were there. And where would you go? What organization was really challenging the issues? And it was Gray Panthers.
You couldn't find a bigger difference between the AARP and the Gray Panthers. For one, AARP is an enormous organization. The Gray Panthers were a movement. Secondly, the AARP was focused on older people.
Wake up and live in Sun City for an active new way of...
Maggie had a real problem in your power in that sense. It was about getting more goodies for older people in her mind.
Wake up and live in Sun City, Mr. Senior Citizen, and why?
She pointed out, even though it's called the Gray Panthers, many members were young women especially, but also guys who saw what she was battling for as over and beyond the question of age.
In the early 70s, we had recent high school graduates from Connecticut come down and form a task force on nursing home investigations. And they testified for the House of Representatives, before the Senate, and went on national TV and made the nursing home abuse situation a visible issue. And of course, Maggie Kuhn was working on that as well.
Residents and patients have rights in this age of self-determination. And we who are on the outside, so to speak, have to be the monitors and the advocates working with patients' rights groups within institutions. But the residents themselves, the patients themselves, have rights that they must learn to affirm.
Now, aren't you going to be glad you got up today? No. Oh, come on.
He tried to get Maggie Kuhn to come to Washington to join this group and provide leadership on nursing home issues. Maggie was taking care of her brother. This was a major issue for her, and she couldn't leave Philadelphia. So Ralph Nader gave Maggie a grant for $25,000.
She brought in Elma Grieselholder and Linda Horn to live with her while they wrote Nursing Home Citizen Action Guide, and it changed the character of her household.
All three of us, under, other circumstances, independently. But I think of what my life would be like without these women. How lonely I would be in this big old house. And how lonely many other women like me are in their big old houses.
Shared housing is a concept that Maggie took hold of and said, well, it's one thing to share with another older person, but how about older and younger people sharing their houses?
Maggie started a separate organization, the National Shared Housing Resource Center, in her house.
It was part of Maggie sort of pushing this philosophy about intergenerational relationships, about changing how we live, the structure of our society, by bringing together the generations.
We depend on each other. I certainly depend on these women for keeping my mind and spirit alive.
Are there any such animals as men on these premises?
We talked this all through before we really got together in a formal way. I mean, as Linda came in, this was one of her major worries. When I came in, I discussed it with Maggie, you know, how much freedom do I have in the house? And she wanted to know how much freedom she had.
The thing that reinforced this feeling of a new lifestyle was the way in which the three of us watched beside the bedside of my brother, who was terminally ill. And how the three of us bore the burden and the pain and the anguish of that.
Because of that sharing, we even grew closer.
Yes, we did.
Sam's dying freed her in a way that we can't even imagine. She had carried those burdens from the time she was a little girl of being her brother's caretaker. And she had incredible sympathy for anybody who had had siblings or children with mental illness. Her brother didn't die until the early 70s. And she said, I got on a plane and I've never landed.
I first met Maggie Kuhn. She calls herself a wrinkled radical. During the summer of '73 in Chicago, it was a convention of the American Medical Association. She and her colleagues, the Gray Panthers, were engaged in guerrilla theater. One of their members played the patient. He had a heart attack, seemingly, collapsed. The doctors open his heart, but find, instead of a heart, green dollar bills. The patient, the AMA. As Maggie said, doctors rarely pay us house calls, so we decided to pay them a house call.
The staff was always afraid, the corporations were going to cut their support, and, and Maggie, I was a socialist, and I'm for socialized medicine, so then they said, don't use the word socialized medicine, use National Health Service. So she was constantly being edited, but you could never edit her.
Maggie's visibility and relatively high profile had to be achieved. It didn't come easy.
And I remember distinctly in the 70s when she would go on national television and she'd come dressed in these crazy outfits with these elaborate colors and clothes that didn't match.
In order to break through the media curtain, you have to do things that are sufficiently outrageous that they cannot be missed. And so you have to protest, you have to make yourself not only obstreperous, but you have to make yourself really sufficiently unpleasant to the authorities so that they will take notice.
Social Security was going broke. It's always going broke, They never invited anybody to speak from the people who were being affected. So at one of the hearings, Maggie decided she wanted to testify.
Mr. Chairman, I respectfully ask to speak on behalf of beneficiaries.
She hoped that the chairman, who was Greenspan, would give her the floor. He refused. Those of us who were in the audience began a chant, give Maggie the floor, give Maggie the floor. And he refused. So more people joined us with a chant, give Maggie the floor. And he asked the security people to get the troublemakers out of the hearing room. And they practically carried Maggie out. But as they did that, all the press left the hearing and came with us to hear Maggie's statement. And that's the way she operated.
I feel, and others of us who have been working for Social Security reform, feel impelled to call to the attention of the Commission what all of this debate is doing to the confidence of the people.
Reaganomics, as we call it, shorthand for helping the few at the expense of the many, shorthand for taking things out of public control into private hands.
The real hazard to it is Reagan's efforts to privatize the system, to implant and erode confidence in it. It's his hidden agenda.
Where is this hidden
agenda? It's in his head.
The president is almost 72 years old, don't you?
Yes, but
the
president is rich and old.
Maggie remembers the Great Depression, when privatization was the word, and it fell on its face. If Maggie were around, she'd call it, we're suffering from a national Alzheimer's disease. That's what we have, a national Alzheimer's disease. There's no past. We limited it. We have more and more privatization. We had all privatization then.
And it seems to me that in a so-called democratic society, that the people need to be heard.
She was very militant, and it raised the profile, not only of Maggie Kuhn, but through her instrument of the lack of representation, the lack of dignified representation of old people in the media.
Are the elderly, the lepers of television, ostracized from public view? Are we so victimized by our own stereotypes that we only recognize as elderly those televised characters who are toothless, sexless, humorless, witless, and constipated?
Let's see who they pick up out there. Oh, it's a lady. I imagine, yes. Let's see now, a lady on the street. And what is your name, madam?
My name is Grandma Frickert. I'm from Murrayville, Idaho.
The Gray Panthers organized Media Watch. You had people around the country monitoring TV programs and sort of keeping track how many times an older person showed up. And when they showed up, was it a negative image, a positive image, a neutral image?
Would you like to see a genuine old master? Well, would you like to see a genuine first edition? Would you like to see a genuine old lump?
What you dish out has really a tremendous effect.
She was always looking for an opportunity to get her message across. And so she'd say, okay, I'll go on the Johnny Carson show, but I'm going to give him a piece of my mind.
Have you happened to see the character I do occasionally on the show, who they call Aunt Blabby?
Yes, I've seen Aunt Blabby, and I wish you wouldn't do her.
Oh, really?
Oh, Aunt Blabby, how are you, dear?
Just like the coast of Maine.
Huh?
A little rocky, a little cold, and a little old.
People laugh, and they shouldn't laugh, because that's the ultimate human indignity.
So she should be a little more independent and not so...
Of course, she should be and feisty. Now, there is something feisty about her, but she ought to be, you know, fighting.
Right.
A life of outrage.
Yes.
A life of...
Oh, bless you, Maggie.
We'll be right back.
And lo and behold, his show was cleaned up after that.
Aunt Blabby, what kind of activities are you involved in now?
I'm glad you asked that. I'm a consumer advocate for the elderly.
A consumer advocate for the elderly.
I suppose you could put it that way, yes. We old people are getting tired of getting ripped off by those big corporations. We're organized now to do something about it.
Now, what do you do?
Well, we complain, we whine, grind, grumble, you know, fret, fuss, beef, bellyache, all of those things. You've heard of Nader's Raiders?
Oh, of course.
Our group is called Blabby's Crabbies.
We had a spot on the docket of the National Association of Broadcasters Code Authority meeting, and we succeeded in getting age discrimination included in the list of prohibited kinds of programming. I'm Maggie Kuhn, National Convener of the Gray Panthers. With me is Lydia Bragger, chairperson of the National Media Watch of the Gray Panthers.
Here's just an example of what people think of age. David Brinkley, he said one night, there's one we all have in common. He was talking about a show that was going on old age. He said there's one ailment we all have in common. We're all growing old. An ailment, old age, an ailment.
Another myth.
Mm-hmm.
If persons over 65 had the purchasing power of persons between 18 and 39, would your programs be different from what they are generally?
We try to program for a national audience. We program for as a mass medium.
Do you think that the FCC has been negligent in monitoring the neglect, really, of the elderly?
I do.
Well,
I do.
I guess we wouldn't have this condition we're in today if it hadn't been so.
Well, what shall we say to the FCC? There's going to be some new people there. Suppose we appoint an elderly person, one of you two people, to the FCC. Would that be a good idea?
It would be a great idea.
Well, I think we'll recommend that.
Age discrimination was a kind of fundamental plank to the Gray Panthers, eliminating ageism in society, age discrimination in employment.
The companies call in for only young men. So I says, what are we supposed to do? Just drop dead?
Just think how destructive it is when someone who's been active all their life and worked and raised children, done their job well, and then within a few years they realize that society wants nothing from them. It's very devastating. It is a quiet destruction of their sense of identity.
They knock off some of these people in a mandatory way because their seniority, maybe union rights, health benefits, makes the young for less. Maggie, of course, was always fighting this.
The Gray Panthers worked hard with Claude Pepper's office to get passage of bill abolish mandatory retirement.
The American people unequivocally express their conviction that age 65 does not signal senility and uselessness when in 1956 they had trusted a 66-year-old man, General Eisenhower, with the vast powers of the presidency. Today, a majority of the justices of the Supreme Court are over 65 years of age, and Congress has been called the most powerful collection of senior citizens in the country.
The Gray Panthers polled all the different congressmen about what age they planned to retire, to get people thinking about whether it was fair to ask people to retire at 65.
In 1978, Congress said you can no longer force somebody to retire at 65, but you could force them to retire at 70. Well, to Maggie, that's a compromise, and compromises aren't what it's about.
And it should be optional and flexible. Mm-hmm. Maybe you would want to retire at 50.
Well, I missed it.
Congress then came along a few years later and lifted the mandatory retirement age altogether. And I think the Gray Panthers really were the fuel behind that in many ways, because they caused people to think about older people in a different way.
We think of old as zesty, gusty, lusty period. One of the signs of our sickness, our own personal sickness, is when we feel complimented, when people tell us not how old we are or how old we look, but how young we are. Why, Maggie, you don't look that old. You don't look 69.
When President Ford was in the White House, a group of us were invited to witness his signing a pension bill. It left some things to be desired, but we were honored to be invited to that occasion. And I raised my hand, and finally he acknowledged it, and he said, "And what have you to say, young lady?" And I commented very firmly, "Mr. President, I'm not a young lady. I'm an old woman."
I'm an old woman, and I'm tough and rough, and I'm ready to fight. It's old, so what's wrong with that, That's what it's about, too. Maggie was making old an adjective of affirmation and pride.
This Sunday Times takes a serious look at the problems of old age
Have a good time, Mum.
and shows us that our fears are quite groundless. We don't become senile at 65. We can do most of the things we did when we were young, and we can lead an active and happy love life. Old age, how to enjoy it.
Can't be much fun being old.
Many people ask me, you're not married, how does it happen that a woman like you has never married? And my standard response is sheer luck.
Maggie loved people, but she had a special affection for younger men. And when I first met Maggie, I was a younger man, and I thought she liked me for my mind. Well, I find out later that maybe there were other things she was interested in, but it was part of Maggie's passion for life.
I like to think that since there are so many more older women than there are men, that there might be an opportunity for older women and younger men to establish some kind of loving relationship. And this, to me, would be an infinite improvement over loneliness and depression as a result.
She did have an affair with a man 50 years younger than she was. I remember her saying quite clearly, the first time he got undressed, he looked like that statue of David right there.
One of my best quotes, quote, unquote, is that learning and sex stop only when rigor mortis sets in.
The whole notion of freeing the human spirit was her underlying philosophy, and the philosophy began with the notion that people are good, and that systems and structures are what make people act badly. So if you can turn them upside down, it lets the natural goodness of people shine through.
Grassroots is the key word. Of course, it has to be bottom up.
In one area, they might be challenging a bank to lower interest rates for older people. In another area, they might be setting up shared housing. In another, they might be challenging nursing homes. And Maggie would go to all these different places, and she'd be on the picket lines with them, shaking her fist with them.
She used to say, I did a little speech and I do a little organizing on the side. And those Gray Panther networks did extraordinary things that truly changed the lives of communities and individuals.
We are the first and only Gray Panther group in the prison.
Well, the group has been meeting since about 20 years. When I met Maggie, the thing that really got me is that she didn't seem old.
Right.
And I'm saying, man, you know, this is all right.
She got out of the wheelchair. She said, I got an exercise for you. And everybody started paying attention about her saying an exercise. She said, you know. She made us get up and she gave us calisthenics. Old folk calisthenics, you know. this, stretching the arms, the neck. Maggie got everybody talking amongst each other. We had a lot of health problems, and a lot of the older fellas wouldn't talk about them. The younger fellas, when they came in the group, started talking about it, what was wrong here and what was wrong there, and how they could help and interact, and how we could work with each other.
Gray Panthers didn't have established programs so much as their program was to change public opinion on things. That's the heart of an advocacy organization, and they went about doing that every way that they could.
The Department of Energy had been asked to do a survey on how to survive a nuclear war. And one part of their survey said that the older people in the fallout shelters should be sent out first into the radiated environment. They should do the cleanup, and they should eat the radiated food.
And when I again check it with the Geiger counter, you can tell by the clicks that it is radioactive.
And that the clean food should be given to the other people, and the reason was they were just old anyway, therefore they had less to lose in terms of their total life expectancy.
Check it again for contamination, find that it is safe, and eat it.
The Gray Panthers organized a press conference in Washington, D.C., and Maggie came up with the term old nuclear waste slaves. And this was irresistible. And there were ultimately over 700 editorials around the country against the old nuclear waste slaves.
She could take concepts and talk about them in ways that just energized people, just got people to stand up and cheer. And she could do that with some of the wildest ideas. I remember one, though, that didn't work very well.
We outlive men. And how do we fulfill our sexuality needs? And I say, and this may sound, maybe there's a possibility of a lesbian relationship in late life. Maybe.
Well, I think she was speaking to an audience of primarily older women, fairly conservative, and there was a real, it mobilized people, but in the wrong direction.
People were threatening to cut off their support to the Gray Panthers, and how dare she say this, and this outrageous. And, you know, once again, you know, Maggie, everybody tried to muffle Maggie, but she wouldn't be muffled.
It was sometimes tricky to be consistent with the messages that we were putting out.
Yes, we know it's a big fluffy
Talk
bun.
to the manager.
It is the manager.
Where's the beef?
He's putting us under the supervisor.
If you ask me, which you didn't, we should call the owner. Hello? Where's the beef?
The Gray Panther Media Watch organization based in New York was asked to make a comment on that, which they did. A couple of the local chapters were asked by the media to make comments on that, which they did. And we found out later that we didn't all come down on quite the same page.
I don't think there's anybody there. I really don't.
The old woman in that ad was either very good because she was standing up for herself and being feisty, or really not the way you want to see old people portrayed because she was just being sort of crotchety.
People kind of laughed about that and loved that. There was affection for the fact that Gray Panthers weren't very organized. What they cared about was the philosophy about making change and not about creating organizations and tax status and funding.
Painting with the big brush. You don't have time to look for the paper clips if you are envisioning into the next century.
I think everyone in the Gray Panther movement knew that a day would come when Maggie would no longer do what she was doing. She thought about the idea of someone to replace her, as did some of the rest of us, but it was an idea that never really took hold.
And as a result, the movement of Gray Panthers has suffered and is surviving, but not flourishing like it did when Maggie was its charismatic leader.
Hello, Maggie Kuhn's office. This is Sue. By the time I came along, Maggie was already described by just about everybody as frail. And when I saw her, that was certainly my impression.
I wear thick glasses which enable me to see if there's good light. And arthritic hands, you can see my hands, bumps and difficulty holding things. I have arthritic knees, so I need a cane. And I can identify with the French who call old age l'âge troisième. When you can't get around with two legs, you need a third leg, l'âge troisième. But life goes on if you have a goal.
And it was difficult, a challenge to get her from home to wherever. But she was determined to get out there. And as she would say, never pass up an opportunity to spread the word. I can remember the time we took her to New York City. Getting onto just that little gap between the platform and the train was like the Grand Canyon. I used to kid her and call it the leap of faith. Getting her up on the stage where she was to speak, they didn't have a railing. And then, of course, I look out, and there's 1,000 people there. That was when she turned on.
There are three things that I like about being old. First, I can speak my mind, and I do. And I'm always surprised at what I can get away with. The second thing that I like about being old is that I've outlived much of my opposition. The people who who said to me, Maggie, that will never work. It's just a crazy idea. They're gone. The third thing in my old age is the honor and the privilege and the sheer joy of reaching out to people like you and being a part of your future.
The last 5 years of her life, her message became distilled. I think what people wanted from her was more, what's it like to be old? What should we do about being old? They weren't really looking for the political prescription for what the country should be doing. They were looking to her for wisdom. At the end, Maggie was struggling with pain. It was hard for her to hold on through that morphine haze. She had a restless night. She often woke up during the night, but this was different somehow. And at one point during the night, her home health aide helped her sit up in bed, and she said, "I am an advocate for justice and peace." Very forcefully, this statement of identity. And then she lay down again, went back to sleep, and never woke up.
When you find an issue, especially a sticky issue, where politics and city administrations don't want to give you a play at all. The growl is when you decide you're going to go on the prowl and get this done. And that's what I was telling you about her. She would make us growl.
I refuse.
I will not embarrass myself.
I'm not embarrassed, I just can't do it. No, I think it's great.
I want to leave that to Maggie's memory.
Americans knew her as the Queen of Camelot, a young and elegant First Lady who brought glamour to the White House. But her influence reached much further, to art, fashion, and American culture. Revisit her legacy in Jackie Kennedy Onassis, Power and Style, tomorrow night at 8 on KQED.